Good evening, everyone. My name's Jenny Mulder, and I'm here on behalf of Moonee Valley Libraries to welcome you to an online author event. On behalf of Moonee Valley City Council, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, their spirits, ancestors and elders, past and present. Tonight, we're very lucky to have Robyn Annear here to speak about her latest book, which is called Nothing New, The History of Secondhand. Robyn is the author of several books, and she's going to be talking to us for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to be handing over for questions and answers. Robyn has written 6 books, including Bear Brass, which is a history of early Melbourne, which is an incredibly popular book with lots of people interested in history and local history in particular. She's also written one of my favourites, which is A City Lost and Found, which is about Whelan the Wrecker in Melbourne, and I have fond memories of, I'm horrified now, but walking around Melbourne in the 70s and 80s in particular, you constantly saw those Whelan the Wreckers signs everywhere that you went. Robyn has been writing for several years, and she won the Civic Choice Award for the 2015 Melbourne Prize for Literature with her essay Places Without Poetry. She's a past member of the Library Board of Victoria, and she won the State Library's inaugural Creative Fellows. She also has a podcast on TV called Nothing on TV, where she uses the Trove newspaper to present stories of an era when there literally was nothing on TV. I would like to welcome Robyn here tonight to talk with us.
Hi, Jenny. I'm not hearing you, Jenny.
Hey.
Hey, now I can hear you.
Good.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Look, I'm really excited to have you here because you've written some amazing books, and Nothing New seems to be, you seem to have tapped into something that is really in all of our lives at the moment. We're looking at ways to repurpose and reuse things, probably because we're not able to get out as we would normally.
True.
So, yes, and it's making us rethink so much of what we do. So I will leave you to it to talk about it.
Thanks, Jenny. That's great. That's a great lead-in. I wrote the book, Nothing New. Where is it? Let me show you. Here it is. Nothing New. Whoops. Nothing New, A History of Secondhand. Because one day I was struck by the idea of where did op shops come from? What was the origin of op shops? Because at that time, this is 2 or 3 years ago, I seemed to spend half my life in op shops. I literally visited one of our local op shops every single day. And obviously that's been a big change during lockdown. I live in Castlemaine, so we're less locked down than many people viewing this will be, and we've had op shops open again for a couple of months now. But it's just not the same. Somehow the heat's gone out of the thing for me. So revisiting the book is a real pleasure. It really brings it back to me, why I wrote about it. So that was my original motivation, was where did op shops come from? And as with all these things, whether it's a book or my podcast or whatever, what starts off as one little question, one little curiosity, grew into something enormous. In other words, this book. And it took me not just back to Europe and to the origins of secondhand there, which of course has big repercussions for the history of secondhand here in Australia, but also the current day, for instance, in Africa and in parts of the world where we send the secondhand stuff that we don't want and that we can't sell. So it covers a big landscape and a long stretch of time, so that I go back to a time when secondhand was normal. There was virtually no new, unless you were royalty almost. There was no such thing as new. Everything, even for the medium and lower rungs of the gentry in Europe and in Britain, they were recycling their stuff, whether it was their furniture or their clothing. We know that Shakespeare left his second best bed to his wife in his will. So things like bedding, blankets, clothing were handed down over generations and were worth, real money and more than that. They were things that you could use until they fell apart, and not just until they fell apart. As you'll see, I'd like to share with you some images because my book has no illustrations in it, and that's why I really love this opportunity to share the illustrations the book would have had if I'd been able to put some in. So this gives you this will, I hope, give you an insight into what the illustrated Nothing New would be. Let me just find something to show you. I spent a lot of time in the writing of this book, as anybody reading the book will do, in Victorian England, because that was where the second-hand clothing scene, and so much of the second-hand scene is framed around second-hand clothing. The second-hand clothing scene really took off in Europe, in Britain and in Europe in the 19th century because of mass production and the Industrial Revolution as much as anything. So more clothes were being produced more cheaply and people were casting things off more quickly. We know this is the beginnings of fast fashion, if you like. But not only that, late in the 18th and in the early 19th, there were many refugees from Europe, Jewish refugees, who had a history in tailoring, in drapery, in the clothing trade. And they injected a great deal of energy in the second-hand trade in London in particular, but throughout Britain and really throughout the world, because they were exporting and importing as well as selling to the locals. So this is a picture from the 1870s, I think, of a shop in Petticoat Lane in London, which was one of the main second-hand clothing markets, and there's still a street market there today. So I'm trying to figure out whether there's a bird cage above the shopkeeper's head. She looks like a really tough customer, doesn't she? For all that she's not a customer, I'd hate to have to try and bargain with her. But you can see the kinds of things she's got there, and those sorts of cotton dresses and petticoats and things that look pretty much like, and skirts that look like pretty much everyday wear and underwear, are the sorts of things that have not survived much in costume collections. The sorts of things we see in costume collections are by and large the clothing of the gentry and tend to be the clothing of silk, because silk was one of the few fabrics or anything that couldn't much be recycled. And Victorian Britain, the Victorian world really, as it still is in some parts of the world, but certainly not ours, it was said there was no such thing as waste. So everything could be recycled. But really one of the few things that wasn't much recycled was silk and finery, and those are the clothes, both men's and women's, that we tend to see reflected in our costume collections that still survive today. Things like these cotton clothes had many lives ahead of them after this woman sold them, as rags, as manure, as stuffing for couches and furniture. So this wouldn't be the last someone would be seeing of these clothes, even if they might not recognise them in their future incarnations. This is one of the, as the caption says, the Jew old clothes men of London, who would travel through the streets crying old clo, or clo, 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 as the caption says, or old clo. And they would be collecting clothes, not selling clothes, but buying clothes from people, going door to door and through the streets with their cry, going to kitchen doors mainly. And the servants or the lady of the house might come out and give them some used clothes or rags in exchange for money. Or some of these fellas used to exchange used clothes for crockery. So cheaply made, transfer printed crockery was pretty newly available in quantities in Britain in the mid-19th century, was being made, mass produced. And your average, not very wealthy woman would love to have some of this pretty stuff in her house. But women didn't have much money or even any money to play with. They had the bare minimum of housekeeping, and that was all the money they had. So apart from scraping together a penny or two now and then, actually exchanging some of their clothes or their husbands for some finery was one way of getting some pretty things and some new stuff for themselves and for their house. And here we are in Rosemary Lane, which was an offshoot of Petticoat Lane. We've got obviously a boot and shoe dealer there, secondhand. They were much in demand. Everybody needed shoes, although if anybody had to go shoeless in a family, it was usually the wife, it was usually the woman. She would make sure that her children were shod, and of course the husband who was going out to work would have to have sturdy boots. But the woman might go shoeless. But these secondhand shoes were often masquerading as wearable shoes. They would be gussied up in ways with dust rubbed into the soles to make it look like they'd recently been worn, and these actually were the soles when they'd just been patched up with a bit of paint and paper on the underneath and then have some street dirt rubbed into them. And so you'd often buy them, and then with the first shower of rain, the water would come in and you'd discover you'd been more or less dudded. Obviously, not just clothing was for sale. Here in Petticoat Lane, we've got old iron and, well, they would have called this an old iron store, which was mainly tools and locks and keys and chains and screws and augers and all sorts of things. And there was a huge trade done in that sort of thing too. You can imagine going door to door and buying or selling that kind of stuff. You needed a cart. You couldn't be doing that with just a pack on your back. Here we've got the bone grubber. All these pictures are from Henry Mayhew's London and the London Poor, which came out in volumes in the 1850s and 60s and was illustrated often from photographs, or as they say, daguerreotypes by a chap called Beard. So the bone grubber would collect bone. He'd be collecting door to door, kitchen doors, collecting bones, and also just in the streets, in the rubbish around the streets would be collecting bones. And bones could be recycled for bone meal, as fertiliser and things, as well as to make bone buttons and all sorts of other odds and ends that could be made out of bone. And if you think about some of the secondhand things you find in antique shops that are made of bone, this bone grubber would be the sort of person who'd be finding the raw materials for that. And here's the London dustman, Dust Ho. A dustman really was a dustman who would be collecting household, not waste, but actual dust from the kitchen floor. So the servants whose job it was to sweep the floor and sweep out the fireplaces would sell to him the dirt and the coals and the ashes, and they would go in his cart to move along to a dust yard where mainly women and children worked, as you can see. A huge yard. There was a dust heap like this in London, which was like a mountain during the 1830s. It had been accumulating for hundreds of years. And I think it wasn't the Crystal Palace, but some grand structure in the 1850s was finally built on there. And apparently the dust was sent to, would you believe, was sold to Russia, where they were rebuilding, I think, St. Petersburg, following the wars with Napoleon. And they needed dirt to fill up the holes and to build roads and things, and they took this great dust pile from London. So this is on a smaller scale. You can see the women sifting the dust. They were trying to find bits of coal, bits of bone, and bits of really anything. And every bit of it, including the dirt itself, could be recycled for making bricks, for building sites, for using as fertiliser, all sorts of ways. And of course they would find valuables from time to time too, but everything they found, bits of paper, you name it, was recycled. Like I say, no such thing as waste. I'm moving along here now. This is the 1890s, and these are actual photographs from a magazine called The Strand, which is where the Sherlock Holmes stories originally appeared in the same period. And these are photos of the lost property offices at big London railway stations, as well as at Scotland Yard at police headquarters. People travelling on trains were travelling on trains at peak numbers and at peak levels, and leaving heaps of stuff behind them. In doing so, it was all collected in these, carried down the line to these big lost property offices, or LPOs. And this was the one at Euston Station. This was just a corner of it. You can see in the foreground some of the most commonly lost item anywhere, anytime, which was the umbrella. At every lost property sale, which were held a couple of times a year, thousands of umbrellas would be sold, and they'd be tied up in bundles of a dozen or so and sold very cheaply to people who would then sell them, possibly outside railway stations on a wet day for next to nothing, so they could be left in trains once again. All sorts of other things here, high chairs, and I don't know, you can just kind of make out. I love all these brown paper parcels that you can see. There's a wheelbarrow there. There's an admiral's hat. Who knows? Here we are at Waterloo Station with a bicycle and many suitcases and the odd umbrella you can see there. It looks like lots of keys and things. Here's a curious collection at Derby, the Midland Railway Company's lost property office. Musical instruments, lawnmowers, buckets, penny farthings, you name it. And here we have, I think this is a reconstruction of the finding of the baby they called Willie Euston, who was found in a trunk just like this in the lost property office at Euston Station sometime in the 1880s. So the story went. He was taken to a workhouse, I think, the poor child, and grew up parentless, but bore that name, Willie Euston. It was not unheard of for babies to be left at lost property offices, but it wasn't such a common thing for them to be found alive. I will say no more on that subject. Scotland Yard lost property office. So Scotland Yard got anything that was found around the streets or in London cabs, which of course were horse-drawn hansom cabs at that time. And the sorts of things tended to be the more upper-class things, lots of umbrellas still, but also lots of opera glasses, ladies' stoles, fur coats and things of that sort, and lots of documents, books, briefcases and so on. So that went to the Scotland Yard lost property office. Here we have one of the umbrella racks at the Euston lost property office. Just look at them. Not all of them are umbrellas. I think there are some walking sticks there too, but you get the impression of how many there would be accumulated in one season. Gloves, a week's gloves at the Liverpool Street lost property office. They were in sacks like the one you can see these ones have been disgorged from. And if you went in looking for a glove, and people usually lost just the one, and I'd expect that would mainly be the right-hand glove, which they'd take off to do whatever. If you went looking for a glove, they'd empty out a week's worth of gloves on the counter for you to ferret through. And these too would be sold for practically nothing by the sack at the regular lost property auctions. And they'd be dyed, usually black and made into pairs as best they could do. But like I say, it must have been tricky when many of them were, I'm sure, right-hand gloves. This is actually at Spencer Street Station in Melbourne, in a big shed they had there for lost property. It was roughly where the Age building is now, if you can picture that, at the corner of Spencer Street and Collins Street, before Collins Street did extend that far. And their auctions here were fabulously well attended, and they happened 4 times a year, I think, around the turn of the 20th century. And the people who loved them most seemed to be the journalists. They were great, human interest stories. The thing that they loved to write about most was the people who would bid on luggage which was sold with contents unknown. People particularly liked swags, which would be sold that way because there was kind of a folklore about them that some nameless somebody had once found a fortune or titles to land back home in Britain, or jewels or whatever. So these sorts of legends rippled through the crowd, and people would go crazy bidding for some manky old swag. And there used to be lots of swags. It makes you wonder what happened to the swagman who had been on the other end of that bit of luggage. But yes, suitcases, handbags, you name it, people couldn't get enough of them because of the possibility of just what might be inside. And sometimes they got a bargain, more often than not, they did not. Thrift is also a big part of secondhand, and this was around 1914, I think. These were some patterns from a book showing you how you could make things out of your husband's old trousers and so on. And this was particularly popular during The wars, I've noticed, as well as during the 1930s depression, you'd read a lot in the newspapers of people telling how they made children's clothes out of their husband's old railway worker's uniform or whatever once he'd gone off to war. So thrift of this sort could take you a long way. A man's shirt might be worn out for his purposes, but you could still make some kids' clothes out of it. And here was the answer to my question: where was the first opportunity shop? It was in Melbourne in 1925 in what was called the Cyclorama, a big old circular building next to St Vincent's Hospital on Victoria Parade, Fitzroy. The Cyclorama was going to be pulled down to build a new X-ray wing for the hospital, but they needed to raise money to do so. So this was one of those efforts. They had all sorts of amazing contests, footy contests and races around Albert Park Lake and raffles, and they had a telephonist contest. I don't know what that involved. And they had this op shop. So what made this different from jumble sales, which were by now a usual thing and would run for a day or two raising money, was that this ran for 3 or 4 months. And the woman in the middle with the dark bobbed hair was Lady Millie Tallis. She was married to a theatrical impresario, Sir George Tallis of J.B. Williamson's, I think. And she and Sir George had recently come back from a motoring trip of America and Europe and had seen these charitable shops raising money, which were, shops as opposed to jumble sales. These shops raising money for charitable purposes. And she said, let's mount one of these in this cyclorama, this circular thing, and call for donations. And the Victorian Railways, transported donations free of charge, or you could leave them in big bins on the railway station platforms of Melbourne. And this place was replenished sort of every day over 3 months. And it made heaps of money for the X-ray wing before the cyclorama was pulled down. Here you can see some of the ladies on one of the opening days. The thing about this, same as with jumble sales, is it was kind of judgment-free. All sorts of people shopped at these op shops or jumble sales, not just needy people, although there was no stigma or not much stigma attached to that, as we might think there was, about getting a bargain. But also, wealthier people. One of the people who was delighted on the first day of this opportunity shop was a young flapper who got a pair of silver shoes for 6pence. And I can just imagine her heading off to one of George Tallis's venues that evening in them. Here's another view of the opportunity shop. The woman there is writing out raffle tickets, I believe, and you can see this is in the sort of furniture department, all sorts of interesting things, as well as a motorbike. The reason it was called the opportunity shop, that was the doings of Lady Millie Tallis. She had seen these shops, as I say, among other places in France, where they were called magasin d'occasion, which meant bargain shop. But occasion can also mean opportunity, and she just put a bit of a spin on it, which I think is a wonderful spin. I'm really glad she did. And as a result, we here in Australia don't tend to have thrift shops or charity shops as they do in the UK and the US. We have opportunity shops, for which I, for one, am very grateful. Coming away from opportunity shops, here we have Mrs. Sparks' second-hand stall at Victoria Market. This is in the 1950s, a shot from the Woman's Weekly. My mum used to, when she was younger, during the Second World War, I guess, and after, her mum used to shop at a Mrs. Nangle's second-hand stall at Victoria Market, and Mrs. Nangle's proud claim was that all the goods she sold had come from Toorak, so they were quality. And of course, this was often the point of secondhand, going right back, certainly to those secondhand dealers in London, was that you could buy better quality and something that would last a lot longer secondhand for less than you could buying new. The mass-produced clothing that started to become available in the mid-19th century, made from fabric from the big cotton mills, often was not the greatest quality, even though it was affordable by many. And it wouldn't last near as long, so the story went. as good quality secondhand. The Brotherhood of St Lawrence was a leader in opportunity shops from the early days, and they opened an opportunity shop not far from the Cyclorama in Gertrude Street, Fitzroy, in 1937, and had op shops going, called opportunity shops, going all the way through from then. Their op shop in Gertrude Street was just a tiny little shop, and I think it moved around a bit depending on what shop was available. You know, they'd fill an unlet shop. They would that was so popular and only opened a couple of times a month, I think, that the police used to have to come and control the crowds because so many people would try and crowd into this tiny little shop that they had to limit the numbers, just as they would now, so that people weren't actually crushed. Women would save up, as far as jumble salesmen, women would save up to buy their annual jumble dress, so a little bit from each week's housekeeping. And just the same, women would save up to buy their child a coat every winter and so on. So getting into that opportunity shop was a great challenge for many. This is inside that opportunity shop we were just looking at, so I can go back. This is on Brunswick Street. It only closed in the last 10 or 15 years. I remember it well. It used to be a toy factory, and it opened in the 1960s under the management of the Mrs. Jones, who was Barry Jones, the Quiz King, and later Member of Parliament and Federal Minister. His mother ran this Brotherhood op shop, and it was furniture, books, and theatrical costumes. They used to sell, this was in the mid-60s, and a lot of people who were dying just then had been around in Edwardian times, and they were getting lots of Edwardian clothes, old First World War uniforms, even Boer War uniforms, and was selling them off here as fancy dress. And very soon after that, you had Mick Jagger going on Ready, Steady, Go, a pop show in the US, in the UK, wearing a grenadier uniform or jacket, and of course the Beatles later doing the same. And suddenly this stuff was no longer theatrical costume, but was something you wear in the street. Here we have a student called Jenny smoking her slim cigar, quoting from a book, and wearing a smock apparently that she'd refashioned from some curtains. And she worked there in the op shop of the Brotherhood. And here the Brotherhood were the great rag merchants. We used to get their paper bags put in our letterbox saying, "Ring when you've filled this rag bag," and our truck will call. And these women at the sorting place in North Fitzroy were the ones who used to unpack all those paper bags filled with our junk. This is the way the Brotherhood used to advertise. Don't feed the moths. Yeah, there you go. A van will call. You notice they say, don't discard it. The Brotherhood will put it to good use and stock their shops and help pensioners and low-income families. They make this point that it's not these second-hand shops weren't just for poor people to shop in. This was the whole point. And some people still have a kind of a reservation about this, like, I shouldn't be shopping in op shops because I'm not poor. It was about raising money, of course, turning that old stuff into money that the Brotherhood and other charities could put to whatever purpose it was that they needed to help the community. Here's the Brotherhood man with his van calling and receiving a bag of rags. And this is what replaced it. 1977, I think it was. The first of these Brotherhood bins went into a Glen Iris service station. And we're familiar with those bins now. They became a great dumping hazard, and many of them have now gone. But that was the big change in the face of rag collecting, I suppose, where you could drop things off anonymously and nobody would know it was you. I'm back. That was my, as I say, those were the illustrations I collected during the course of putting my book together that I would have loved to include, but it's kind of good to have them as the secret, the alternative, nothing new, that I can just share with select people. I've been talking for close to half an hour. Can I just whiz through something else? I want to do this really quickly. I have something else I want to share with you, so bear with me while I do it. This is my knitting pattern collection. Everyone has something they collect. I collect knitting patterns going back to the 1930s, like this one. This little boy here, look at him in his knitted suit, knitted tie, knitted shirt, knitted shorts, and I think this is the same guy. Look at him; he doesn't look very happy in the second one. I don't think the knitting pattern children were very happy as a rule. Here he was supposed to be Guy, and the poor boy had knitted spats. Look at him, and a little I don't know what is that, seagull that he was feeding. This boy, or at least his jumper, was called Jeremy. They always gave the jumpers, the knitted garments, a name, and this model was called Jeremy, and there he is. God knows what's going through that boy's mind as he looks at that cord. I can only imagine. Here we have Austin and Monty. Look at that Monty. He's going to be commanding an infantry sometime. Look at how he's pointing at that newsagent saying, I want that whizzer and chips. Here's Cliff, and he looks like a Cliff, doesn't he? And here, that is Bill Hunter, the actor, who at this point in his career possibly had just appeared on the beach, where he had mainly a swimming role. Being Australian, he was a good swimmer, and I think he had to put on an American accent while swimming. Fairly challenging. But his career only went forward in fits and starts, and in the meantime, he made a living of some sort, being a knitting pattern model. Here he is at a car trial for Volkswagens, and you'll see it says with TV designs. These were ones you could knit in front of the TV without taking your eyes off the TV. So they were easy ones, was the idea. Here he is. Here's Larry, and I can't remember the names of the guys behind him, but you can see he's managing them. They're the band, and he's saying, yes, Frank, we'll see you at Surfside 6 on Thursday, smoking the obligatory fag, as you had to do when you were a knitting pattern model. And I would swear that this little boy, Eric, circa 1940-something, was the very same Bill Hunter as a child. So I think he had a long career in knitting pattern modelling. We move into the 60s here, where things got crazy, knitted Bermuda shorts. The question, of course, is why. And the 70s. You look at knitting patterns, and it brings home, if you need it brought home to you, that the 70s were like no other time before or since. I mean, we think we do retro, but nobody's this crazy. Look, the boy had long hair, the girl had short hair. Look at what they're wearing, and look at these lasses here. I mean, you got to laugh. I think this is the 80s. It had very big appliances then. I don't know whether that girl has a CB radio, but it's very big. And one of them has a bit like a dolly cut, a bit of a Susie Quattro look there. I love this, the jumper for the injured cockatoo. It shows how you make it, and you have to sew it up after you put it on the bird, and it tells you to sew the neck only loosely so their crop can work, otherwise they won't be able to swallow their seed. Love that one. And this is one of my favourites from the 80s, those crazy 80s. You've got to ask yourself what indeed this is about. It took me a lot of figuring out to read the fine print in the knitting book to discover these are supposed to be matches, not teats, as they look, some freakish sort of device. One day I will knit that jumper, but not just yet. My collection, knitting patterns. I'm sure many of you have them, and now is your chance to tell me about them or ask any questions possibly. Jenny, what do you collect, Jenny?
I do have a few knitting patterns actually, and I was looking at some of those knitting patterns and laughing to myself because I have fond memories of, well, some of those vests. My mum was a huge knitter, and she used to knit things like that, but I also knitted too as well. So I do have a few old ones actually. Some of the old baby patterns I've got somewhere filed away.
Yes.
I collect lots of different things, and it was actually interesting when you went back to the very start and you were showing the images of the I'm using my hands and you can't see me, but you were showing the image of the ironmonger.
Yep.
Well, it's not an ironmonger, but she was selling secondhand iron things. And I couldn't help but think that my husband and I go to a lot of markets and antique shops and places like that, and op shops too as well. And my husband's always drawn to those sorts of stores, which are still around. And he has bought a whole assortment of those sorts of tools. And I was looking and thinking, my husband would be in seventh heaven if he was looking at all of that.
Don't you love to see those things? And sometimes you see those tools and you think, what on earth is this? They look kind of like torture devices. I bought this thing earlier in the year, one of my op shop finds early this year before the op shops closed. It's an old Moonee food processor, but it's a big one. It's not the one that you squeeze. It's one that you have a handle that you rotate, and it's got all these different things. And it looks like the lunar landing craft that was landed on the moon. It's got these big legs. It's just a crazy looking thing, but I just love the way it looks. I'm never going to use it, but I just love the way it looks. Beautiful.
And the work that's gone into them is quite
Yep.
amazing, and they're
The
made so
engineering.
well.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you look at the fine ironwork or metalwork, and you can see they were meant to last. They weren't meant to
Absolutely.
be used for a couple of years and then discarded. They were
No.
meant to last forever.
Yeah.
And in fact, going back to tools, I don't want to hold going back to tools, my husband also, one of the reasons he collects a lot of tools is he said they work better than the
Huh?
ones he's bought new.
Yeah.
So he works on old cars, and he likes to have older tools.
Yeah, those little ball peen hammers and things, they're just, well, partly they've also been used a bit, so they're worn to a lovely, there's no rough bits or seams or anything on them like there are on modern ones. They're just beautiful to use. And just knowing
Incredibly well made,
yeah,
yes.
and holding the handle, someone else has held a lot too, that the way the wood has taken on the shape of someone else's hand is quite something
there's
too.
something about it, isn't there,
Yeah, I
about
agree.
holding something that was meant to be held and used.
Yeah.
And kitchen things too as well. You mentioned the moolie, the food grinder, and my mum had a little one that about that size that you would fasten. She had two different sorts actually. Another one was the wind one,
Yeah.
and she used them all the time, every
Yeah.
year for making jams and
Oh, yes,
sauces
it'd
and
be
things
great
like
for
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've yet to find a use for mine, but one day I will.
I haven't used them, but I can remember them being used every single summer for all of my younger years.
Yeah. No, you're right. The fruit, that would be the thing. Jam. Thank you
Yeah,
for putting that thought in my head.
yeah,
With
yeah,
summer
jam
approaching.
and sauce for the
Yep,
grinding
the
ones.
tomatoes. Yeah.
And Mum, I know in your book you mentioned that cooking utensils and things like that are another thing that people use constantly.
Yeah.
And my mum had a lot of stuff that would have gone back probably to when she was growing up, if not
Yes.
earlier, and she
Yeah.
just kept using it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And often some of those things, whether it's a spoon or whatever, actually would have found its way with a family that came here during the gold rushes or whatever from the other side of the world. They might not have been able to bring many possessions with them at all, but they could bring small practical things like that with them. And those are the sort of things that are still knocking around in some families that I reckon have come from far away and deep in time in the history of families.
Yes, like I've got an old metal tin with
Yep.
an address on it. I'm just looking too, in case you're wondering, I'm looking in the corner because I've got some other questions. So
I was thinking you might.
Yeah, I do have a few questions. So if you wanted to just talk for a minute, and I'll go through
Okay.
these questions and ask you. All right. Actually,
yeah. What have
no,
you got?
yeah, I've got one. All right. What are your thoughts on how some op shops are run nowadays, particularly Vinnie's and Salvos, who have new products and highly inflated prices on secondhand goods?
Yeah, it seems kind of crazy. And I'm lucky. I feel like I must be cushioned from this here in Castlemaine in the country, although we have both those shops, Salvos and Vinnie's here. But people often ask me, especially people in the city. So I gather things must be a bit different there. But certainly Vinnie's do have higher pricing policies and they have new stuff. And I'm just confounded by that. Why? I can only think they're trying to attract a customer base that wouldn't buy secondhand. So they're trying to draw people into the shop to buy new things rather than secondhand. And they might come around to buying secondhand while they're there. So they're trying to kind of literally sanitize the experience, I guess, or have something to sell to people who aren't secondhand buyers. And as for the inflated prices, again, I don't really understand why, because they're getting so much stuff through. Selling it fast and selling it cheap always seems to me the smartest policy. But on the other hand, we know that international textile dealers will take any stuff that Vinnie's, the Salvos, whoever don't want to sell, and buy it in bulk by weight and parcel it up according to whether it's t-shirts, trousers, socks, whatever, and take it to Africa or to parts of Asia or to South America and sell it there, where it'll be sold out in the open in marketplaces. So there's always a market for it. Vinnies and salvos will get some money for that, not much, but some. So they're obviously making a calculation that they want to have only the top line stuff at top line prices. Of course, some people's complaint is it isn't top line stuff, but it's top prices. So I don't know. I'm confounded. Here I volunteer in the salvos here, and it's not a salvos store, which is the more upmarket sort of store. Ours is just a salvo. They call it a salvos thrift store, and the difference is with the thrift stores, they only sell stuff collected locally, and the money is put back into the local community. Whereas with the other ones, they're a Victoria-wide thing, so the clothing can come from anywhere. That appeals to a lot of people and always has, because you don't necessarily want to see your stuff worn down the street by someone else, or vice versa. You don't want them to see you wearing their old stuff. In a small town, there's a strong chance of that. In fact, I love that when it happens, but not everyone does. Whereas if your stuff is coming from, Belgrave, Glen Iris, Essendon, wherever, then the chances of you wearing the clothes of someone you know or might meet are fairly slim. So, but I don't understand their models. I feel like op shops are increasingly run by people who aren't op shop people, and they're trying to make them into something that they're not. But as I say, the op shops I work in, we get so much in the way of donations, and we turn it around and sell it as cheaply as we can to get rid of it, and that seems to work. So I'm a big fan of that.
I've got quite a few questions here now. I've got another one here that is on a similar vein, so I'm just going to jump to that. Do you think that the quality of our op shop treasures has gone down or are harder to find?
Harder to find's probably fair, but one thing I found in the course of my research is that going right back to the early 19th century, you find accounts of people saying all the good stuff's gone. You don't find those treasures, that you don't find that great stuff that you used to. So nostalgia plays a part in thinking there used to be better stuff. There used to be older stuff for sure. When I started going to op shops in the 1970s, there was lots of 1920s and 30s clothing there, because these were the people who were passing away then, whose wardrobes were being emptied out. So it's always going to be a reflection of that. And I know that vintage is a fluid concept, and it sort of is always a couple of decades, 2 or 3 or 4 decades before the present, or preferably before you were born, is I think that's kind of
yes.
is the kind of cutoff. So for people like me, it gets further and further away and harder to find that stuff than before I was born. But there isn't, so they're better. The op shop people are better at spotting vintage. So if something's from the 90s, there are people there who will spot it and go vintage and put it on a vintage rack with a high price. Once upon a time, it seemed to me, the ladies who worked in op shops were completely clueless about that. I mean, just the idea of vintage was not there.
It is a big thing now.
And to them, it was just old clothes. Of why on earth would anybody want to wear this? And those were golden times, of course. So there's just more awareness, and I guess more younger people working in op shops who are alive to the fact of what is vintage. Yeah.
Where do you get your inspiration from?
For my books? Or for
I think that must be that's the question. So your books are all on history so
yeah.
You have
it's just, it's things like the central question, the prompting question that this one grew out of, where did op shops start? There's usually some cue that triggers my curiosity, and it's as simple as that. And I am so self-centered, obviously, that I then go, well, if I'm interested in the answer to that, maybe somebody else will be. And it seems to be a fair enough assumption that somebody else will be. How many of those somebodies is another question, but that's how it works. It's just like it'll be something that really lights my fire, and you just have to proceed on the assumption that if it's exciting to you, that you can make it so for other people. So I'm just always looking out for something that's
Always looking for something. I'm glancing through the questions as I'm speaking to you, and I can see that we're going to come back to that shortly.
Okay.
I've got a question here asking, when did buying in an op shop become a bit stigmatized? I think that's historical rather than now, back historically rather in the present time, I think they mean.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for some people, it will always be stigmatized. And that's something I became more and more aware of as I was writing this book. People would say, "What are you working on?" I would tell them. And some people's reaction was just so, I could not go there. I will never go into an op shop. I hate this. Particularly, I hate the smell of op shops, things like that, which to me, I love the smell of op shops. It would never occur to me to think that. But, it is a barrier for some people that they cannot pass. So that's a temperamental thing or a life history thing. But the book actually charts the stigma of secondhand, so that earlier in the 19th century and certainly before that, it was just normal. It was just everyday life. But the stigma is, you're going to be surprised to hear this, the stigma is largely a creation of capitalism, who of course wanted you to buy new. So once mass production was a thing, and there were these huge factories producing cotton and then producing garments from said cotton or woolen fabrics, paying people very cheaply and in factory settings and so on. They wanted to sell this stuff and to put secondhand, out of business and put it on the nose. So the stigma was created largely by parties who wanted you to buy new.
More.
So there's that. And then from there, from the 1870s onwards, it took an even deeper dive where it became largely associated with charity. So charities at that stage began not just giving people money or Bibles or whatever, but actually giving them secondhand clothes. And really nobody much liked this. They might have been happy enough to wear secondhand clothes, but just this assumption that was like all you deserved or somebody else's cast-offs. That was where this somebody else's cast-off stigma came in, of being forced to wear other people's cast-offs because that was all there was for you.
That makes sense, because my mother, and well, it was my mother, she would buy secondhand furniture, but we never had secondhand clothing because of the stigma. And
that's right. It was a big thing during the Depression. It was a big thing, and particularly I discovered, particularly with farming women. And of course, there have been some really lean times on on the land in the 20th century, and whenever. But then there'd be this on occasions there were these big campaigns to get together secondhand clothing to give these farming families, who were doing it, and it was the reaction against that was just no. So, for some communities as well, the stigma is greater.
And it was a very, very strong stigma, farming background. She grew up in the Depression, and she certainly passed that on to me, because I have no problems buying secondhand furniture and other options, but I find it difficult to buy clothes. And that's passed on. But this is not about me. I've got more questions. What's your favourite op shop find, if you have one?
Oh, man, so many things. Well, look, I have something here. So this is kind of, look at this. This is called, I'm going to bring it up it's called Pitman Shorthand Short Stories. So these are actually short stories written in shorthand, I guess for testing your shorthand reading skills, because, of course, reading your own shorthand back is as important as writing it. So here's one called The Missing Antique, and it's written, so my ambition now is to learn sufficient shorthand to be able to read these stories, because I'm sure they're fantastic. Actually, I'm not sure they're fantastic, but I like to think that they are. And they're so mysterious to me that I'm determined to learn shorthand. And as part of that, you talk about where do my ideas come from. Then I started looking into the history of shorthand, and it is just mind-boggling. It was going to forge a whole new world democracy, a world language. You're going to be able to communicate with anybody if you could do shorthand, because it was all about hearing sounds and not hearing languages. So anyway, that's been a great find, because it's opened a whole new door for me.
I've got another just message here saying that it was a wonderful talk. Thank you, Robyn. And this particular person has noticed how popular Savers has been over the last few years, and that recycling is certainly riding away, which I think we've spoken about before this session actually started. She's also commenting, or he, is that her favourite is children's picture books. They sell for about $2, and it's a great way of building a working library, as is coming to our library, of course, for a grandchild. And do you think we'll ever see the op shop principle extended to the extent we approach zero waste? That's an interesting question.
It is, yeah. I'd really like to think that it's going to play a big role, because certainly for younger generations are so much more aware of aiming for something like that they're keen, they're motivated, they're cued in. Not everyone, of course, but there's a lot of awareness, so that's great. And I just think that the op shop, there's a whole peak body for op shops and secondhand now, and I think there's real potential there for them to work with industry as well as with governments to really play a bigger role in recycling and in getting used stuff back into people's hands, rather than being junked, so that there's less landfill and so on. So I don't know exactly how that happens, but I think the motivation is there. The challenge, and I go back to sound my hobby horse, but the challenge will be, it's not in the interest of business for this to happen, of course. So what do? They're doing some window dressing, sometimes literally window dressing around secondhand, some of the big clothing chains and so on. They might have a bin at their shop where you can bring your used clothes and then get a discount when you go to buy the next one, or something like that. Sometimes they're recycled, so that you can get recycled cashmere, for instance, which is sold as this great ethical thing, and you pay a fortune for it. Things like this, but it's just tinkering around the edges, and it's big business trying to figure out how they can make this pay for them. But ultimately, it's not going to pay for them, and so I think the same forces will be at work to pressure governments in particular, and we know that big business has a lot of influence over governments, to pressure them to downplay the recycling angle. So it's going to be a lot of push and pull, but like I say, I have a lot of faith, particularly in younger people, that they are going to do a lot of pushing in that direction. And I think we're well positioned for it. Op shops are working well towards that.
I've got a comment here that is saying that one of the people that have been watching tonight had one of those Moulinex suits
yes.
to make baby food. So that's just a comment. I've got a question here from someone who would like to know, what is the oldest surviving op shop in Melbourne or Victoria?
As far as I know, the oldest surviving one is downstairs in the Royal Arcade in Melbourne. It's one of the Brotherhoods of St Lawrence's ones. Now, as far as I know, that op shop has been there since the 1940s in some form or another. Now, I only discovered it in the, I don't know, maybe 1990s, but it's been there a long time. So as far as I know, that's one of the oldest, but I dare say somebody else will know of another. I mean, the Voluntary helpers shop is no longer around. Does anybody remember that? Was it Camberwell or North Balwyn, and they used to advertise on TV late at night. It was in the early 70s, I suppose, before I'd ever seen an op shop. And I used to think, what are those old women doing? They're always sort of dusting a vase or arranging something. I just could not imagine and they were such genteel looking women, so it was completely counter to anybody's idea of secondhand, which was the idea. It was very genteel. But they were a big fundraiser, non-denominational fundraiser for nursing homes and things, and they were huge, one of the few secondhand outlets at that time.
I remember them. I've got another comment here, or another question, saying, are you sitting in your wardrobe, Robyn?
I am sitting in my wardrobe. Well spotted.
I've also got a question here about sewing machines, and the comment is, Mented has a small selection of sewing machines. Anything in your book about sewing machines?
No. No, I've got some stuff about making rugs out of rags and things of that sort. So more but not about sewing machines.
I've still got 13 questions to go, Robyn.
Okay, let's keep them going.
because I've probably talked too much, I'm sorry. What lessons from the past do you think we can use now to help with the recycling crisis?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, because having written this book, I can see how that culture of there's no such thing as waste was undone by essentially fast fashion, or the forces that have led us to fast fashion. I don't know how we can undo that, other than doing what we can to resist it. And people are doing that more. I mean, more people are going to op shops and buying and selling secondhand online. Through all those online forums and venues for secondhand dealing, as well as what do they call it? Those free things where instead of putting stuff out on your nature strip,
free
for yeah. Well, you just say, I've got blah. If you want it, come and get it. I mean, that stuff is great, and that's going to make a big difference, it seems to me, because you're going to get rid of your stuff, someone else is going to get it for nothing, and it's not going to go to the dump.
I've got a comment here saying that they're interested in Bruce auctions, which I don't know about. Was this notion imported or totally homegrown? So you don't know anything about that?
What's that called?
Bruce auctions, BRUCE.
No, I do not know Bruce auctions.
Well, unless someone will pop back in and tell us a little bit about that, and we can get back to that. Someone has asked if you've read Catherine Wilson's book, Tinkering, Australians Reinvent Do-It-Yourself Culture.
No, I haven't. That sounds great. I'm going to put that on my list as well. That's 2 books I've got.
Two books. Yep. Okay, I've got a comment here saying, I've worked in Vinnies and the managers are expected to make a certain amount of money each day. That's interesting.
Good, great.
If they don't make X amount per day, they are put under pressure by head office to do better. That's
well, this is where this centralisation thing could be insidious. I can see that,
Yeah, it's very much a sales thing, because I know people who are in sales have those that push too as well.
That's such a pity. It's so antithetical to St Vincent Paul's, mission and so on. So, anyway, it doesn't surprise me.
There's another comment here. My motto is always secondhand is my first choice. I've yet to convince some of my friends, but hubby is well on board. Great talk.
Hey.
Thank you. So that was
great.
Another comment here saying a fabulous presentation. I've got something here saying businesses are joining together to buy and sell secondhand textiles. Walmart in the US, for example. NACRO is joining forces with a number of not-for-profits and charities and op shops to collect and sell textiles.
So NACRO is this peak body, the national something of the text of community. No, anyway, it's the op shop, basically the op shop peak body. It's great that they're a national body, and they're big enough and powerful enough to talk with business, and I think that's definitely a way ahead, and government as well. So
okay, so they're the body that people are looking to. I've got another comment here saying my granddaughter and I spend hours each week at the local op shop, and so she could choose how to spend her $2. Many happy memories. And my last question here is, have you studied how other countries, cultures have gone through the process of using and reusing items and avoiding new products? You did touch on that a little bit, but did you want to talk about that a little bit more?
I don't know. I mean, from my reading and writing, the experience that I document in, say, Britain in the 19th century seems to be still being carried on, largely though out of financial need in some countries where a lot less is wasted. Places like China, of course, are dumping grounds for recycling, where as we know, there was a stoppage in our recycling stuff that we were sending to them last year, because they were just being overwhelmed. And certainly there are some cities and towns in China that I've read of, for instance, where things like, e-waste go to, and they are hugely polluted, and the people are unwell, and their groundwater is polluted as a result of the amount of e-waste that's being processed and the way they're doing it. There's some towns that just, would you believe, recycle Christmas tree lights from the US, which they get thousands of tons of each year. So they're sold from China to the US. They throw them away every year. They end up back in China in this one particular town where they families have workshops in their own homes and sheds where they burn off the plastic coating from the wires, and in the process breathe in, of course, noxious fumes, and the impacts on health and on pollution locally are shocking. So that's some negative stories, obviously, about recycling, but it just shows how our consciousness about recycling does not always have good impacts for people somewhere far removed from us. But certainly some countries are still, much more in touch with, usually out of necessity, out of bare need, but are more in touch than we are with recycling and using every ounce of everything. Some countries in Scandinavia, wealthier countries, are doing interesting things with recycling, where they're actually burning even fabrics and so on, waste fabrics and waste clothing, to create as a power source and so on, and doing so with relatively low emissions and stuff like that. So, yes, some people are certainly ahead of the curve compared to us on how they recycle, but lots of places are not. And, it's largely shaped by people wanting us to buy more new things.
I've just got a comment there saying reiterating what you just said and talking about Sweden. But
yeah,
I had a comment, sort of question type thing, but I was interested when I was reading your book. I was disappointed not to find any pictures. So I thought it might have just been because I had an ebook copy of it, but
no, the publishers just said, no, we won't have any pictures.
So I was interested to see, in particular, the picture you showed of the people with the dust, sieving the dust. One, because I don't know, it just seems that I seem to have looked at things about recycling and the past and mending quite a lot in the last few months, but it reminded me of the scenes you often see of Asian countries, third world countries, where they're doing the same thing now. You see families, often women, but incredibly poor people, children more often than not, going through that rubbish with a fine-tooth comb.
Combing through dumps,
and that is what they were doing back then.
That's exactly right. So it was happening as we saw, but if you go back and look at the history of, say, the New York garbage system in the early 20th century, families and combers, as they call them, we think of beach combers, but combers used to go through the stuff, find valuable waste, that is stuff they could recycle and go and sell, whether it was wire or whether it was cloth or whether it was paper or whatever. All those things could be sold for money or reused themselves. And you're right, kids would do it, the whole family would do it, and thereby eke out an income from it. And like you say, we see scenes of that today too.
Yeah, we do. It seems that those sorts of things are just happening, but as you say about the less savoury side of recycling, where they're burning off toxic plastic, creating toxic fumes. Often those things are removed, so we're not viewing them. They're there, but we're just not seeing them.
No, that's right. Yeah. Affluence makes us less likely to recycle, and when you see people trying to eke the use out of everything, it's a sign of a lack of affluence in that place. And so it was with Australian society, with British, American, European, and whatever. It's affluence sees a downturn in recycling. So, we're at this interesting time where people are wanting, we're more affluent in many ways than we ever have been. Well, not entirely, but sort of. And people are more interested in at least the idea of recycling or being seen to recycle or making an effort to recycle. So, we've got those two forces at work now, and I think that puts us at an interesting point in history. And
interesting too, given the year that many of us have had, where we haven't been able to go out and indulge our compulsion to buy new things all the time, and realised, well, certainly I've realised that I really only need to go and buy food. I have everything I need. Even if I have gone up a dress size and nothing fits me anymore, I really don't need to buy anything new. So that making do mentality is coming back in lots
That's
of
right.
ways.
For different reasons or somewhat. But yeah.
Yeah,
No,
somewhat.
I
It'll
think
be
we'll see
interesting
more of
to
that.
see whether that carries on
Yeah.
after um, the events of this year have finished.
Yeah. When they let us loose again.
When they let us loose again, or next year, depending on what happens, it might have been a wake-up call for us.
Of course.
I'm not quite sure. Um, so I've been getting so many comments here, Robyn, just to let you know about how wonderful the talk was and how interesting. I've got another comment here saying, do you think we should be teaching sewing in schools? Because, in the olden days, well, not in the olden days when I was at school, and I think most people were at school, we did learn sewing, but I'm not sure if that's on the curriculum now.
No, it would be very much a sort of an elective, I think. I think some, and it's more unisex than it used to be too. It used to be very
Yeah.
much a girls' thing. It would be great because that idea of being a maker is big again. So I think I've noticed in our town sewing classes and so on have really taken off in the last couple of years, and I'm sure. Yeah, I don't know. In school, I hadn't thought of that, but I think it's just a bigger thing. I think girls, in particular, but not just girls, are more likely to say to their mums, "Show me how to do that," than they might have been a generation ago.
I've got a comment here saying, I'm conscious that we're a few minutes over time, but I've got a comment here saying recycling implies downcycling, and that perhaps we should consider better terms like upcycling, reuse and repair.
Yeah.
And sewing in schools has to come back.
Has to come back. I agree. Yeah. And
actually, I do want to make another comment. Very early on, you were mentioning about the lost property in the railway stations, in particular, and people buying suitcases without knowing what was inside of them. And I don't know if you're aware that, but there is a whole television series devoted to people buying old storage sheds and stuff like that. They bid on them.
Sight unseen.
Sight unseen, and then someone will make a fortune on
it's huge. It's just huge. I know that was actually, I was wondering if that was what Bruce auctions were. I don't know, but yeah, it's huge. It's big here in Australia, but there's that TV show. What's it called? Storage.
Something like that.
Storage Wars.
Yeah, Storage Wars. I couldn't help but think of that as you were talking about the suitcases. So,
interesting. That's the modern iteration of that. But I like it.
So. Yeah. And the lost property, all those umbrellas. There's a comment here saying Bruce auctions is similar to Lloyd's auctions.
Oh, okay. So they'd be quite upmarket then.
Yeah, it sounds like it, doesn't it? Yeah,
it certainly does.
Mm.
Yeah, no, the only sort of really upmarket auctions I touched on in the book are can't remember what they're called, but they're the sort of auctioneers to the stars in Hollywood, and they're the ones who sold Michael Jackson's Single Glove for $2 million and things of that. Something belonged to Elvis, I forget what it was. So yeah, I've written about that, but no, I don't know about Bruce's auctions. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, I'll have to look into it too. We'll Google it. I've just had a comment pop up here saying that I need to remind everyone to answer the poll to let us know what they think about tonight's event. So most important that I do that.
Yes, good.
So that we get
there it is.
Get some feedback about tonight's event and what people thought about it. And just to let everyone know, we really do value feedback, because that's what we use to guide what we offer, because we like to provide what the people want.
What people want, yeah.
Exactly, what people want. Bruce Auctions donate to all sorts of things to raise money, often for church buildings. That's interesting. Sometimes goods were donated back to re-auction.
Right, there you go.
Okay.
We'll find out about that.
Yeah, we will. So sometimes they're saying that they auction geese, china, hay, bales, etc. It sounds like a very country thing, doesn't it?
It does.
I'm going to Google it and find out more.
Good, yeah. We've learned something tonight, I think, Jen.
We have learned something. And for everyone out there, we do have Robyn's books in the library. Many of them are available as ebooks, although nothing new is out. But you can put your name down on the waiting list, and even if it is an ebook, you can put your name down for a waiting list for that. And we also do have physical copies of many of Robyn's books that hopefully will be available as restrictions ease a little bit later.
Yeah.
So put your name down for them anyway. The poll is still up. It's been a wonderful talk, Robyn. I could talk all day. As I said, it seems to be that this is something I'm looking into more and more, because I showed you that other book that I was looking at, and I've been watching a lot of TV shows about this particular subject, and it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So
no, it's really uppermost in people's minds increasingly. So that's great. That's going to have good outcomes, I reckon, and it's fun.
It is. It's fun, and it's interesting. It makes you think. Like reading through your book and you know, the other things I've been reading makes us realise how far we've become removed from the consequences of what we buy and what we do and what we're using. So things like the milk bottles, that were always reused, and now we don't do that anymore. And
no, I think buying secondhand and thinking secondhand and thinking recycling or upcycling, it is a more conscious way of consuming, but it's also a more creative way of consuming, because you know you can't go into a shop expecting to find a thing in your size or your colour or whatever. You've got to go in with an open mind, or you know, if it's furnishings or whatever, you've got to go in with an open mind, and when you see what's there, you have to kind of do some calculations and some creative calculations about, can I make this work? It's not what you've got to go into it as a much more open-minded, fluid sort of consumer experience, I reckon. And I like that, the fluidity and the creativity of putting yourself out there in the secondhand market, instead of going to somewhere where they will have the thing that you need for that purpose. You know, you just got to dive in and see what's available, and the serendipity of that is what really appeals to me more than anything.
And you're right, the creativity, which I think is really important to so many of us now, that we're really wanting to engage with that side of our our personalities, or our
It just makes it a more you're an active consumer instead of a passive one, I suppose, when you're having that experience. That's what it feels like to me anyway.
I like that. That's a great comment. I've got another comment here. So people are still watching. That somebody has commented that her 34-year-old daughter has only purchased 3 or 4 new items for her third child. She's got 2 girls, and now she's expecting a boy. So they won't matter.
There's lots of stuff out there. That's right. Yeah, exactly. You can't be squeamish about it, but there's so much secondhand stuff out there for kids. I can't imagine why you'd want to buy it new.
Yes.
It's all been donated with love, I'm sure.
Very much so, that's the case. Look, it's been a wonderful talk, Robyn. I could talk all night, and if you let me, I will. Apparently, we're not allowed to do that. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
I would have loved to have met you in person, but that's not possible at the moment. But it's been lovely to chat.
That's for another day.
Yeah, that's for another day. Exactly. We can talk in the new year. Who knows?
Yeah.
Sometime soon. No doubt. Have you got another book that you're writing now?
Yes, I have.
Oh, have you? Okay. Any spoilers or none?
No.
No spoilers. No, that's all right.
Surprised.
Surprises are nice. I like.
But we might get a chance to talk about that.
Yes, we might. Tonight was wonderful. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Robyn, and thank you everyone who came along tonight. Look out on our website for news of more events that are coming up, and also check our catalogue for Robyn's books. And as I said, you can borrow them either as ebooks, or you can borrow hard copies once we're available for borrowing in that format, which will happen.
It won't be far off.
It won't be far off, yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, Robyn. It's been
Jenny.
A wonderful, wonderful night, and thank you to everyone who came. Thank you.
Thanks. See you again.